Chapter 22. Atlanta was a hot city that day, and the air conditioner was dribbling and leaving a pool on the floor. Too bad it wasn't helping to keep the station house cool.
I hate summer in Atlanta,
Andrew Venice thought. He'd give anything to be hanging around up north somewhere. Anywhere, so long as it wasn't 90 degrees in the shade and full of concrete. He had halfway convinced himself to go down to the cantina and get a cold, tall one, when someone shouted at him.
"Hey, Andy, you got a visitor."
Andrew raised his bleary eyes from the mass of papers on his desk. It had been a long day, and in spite of all his efforts to dig up everything he could on this case, he was still no closer to figuring out who has killed Henry Archer than he had been when they found Archer dead. The scattering of evidence wasn't producing any clues that he could use. Suffice to say, he was not a happy camper just now, and it was playing old Harry with his temper. The last thing he wanted was a visitor. Perhaps some wino coming in to report seeing pink elephants in the alleyways of Atlanta. The city was full of crazy drunks, and most of them ended up at the police station at one time or another. Of course, being a detective, Andrew didn't usually have to put up with them. The desk officer at the door was usually the one who was inundated with drunks and flusies and every other wacko in the street.
I'm just the murder guy. Who is it, Sergeant?
Andrew growled. He hated interruptions, especially when he had not had enough sleep. He'd been up all night staring at the photos of Archer's body. It had been too hot to go to sleep last night. Even sleeping in his underwear had not been comfortable. He would have stripped naked, but old Lady Carson in the flat across the way was already on her last pacemaker. No use in giving the old girl a kick-off before her time, though she would have gone with a smile on her prune face. The sergeant merely stepped aside, pulling his police hat off his head and holding it in both hands. His cheeks had a sort of apple glow. He turned his eyes to look just down the hall and smiled.
Well,
Andrew barked. A woman with a head full of hair as red as a roaring fire stepped through the doorway. She had green eyes like the rich emeralds in a princess crown, and they settled on Andrew the way a fox looks at a chicken that strayed from the henhouse. Hungry but hesitant and wary in case there was a dog nearby. He puffed his chest and stood up, enjoying the way her eyes rode up and down his well-built frame. Clearly she appreciated how well set up he was. In turn, he stared, unabashed, at her voluptuous figure, clad in a short, tight black leather skirt and pink frilly blouse open nearly to the navel. He put her about 35, though she might have been able to pass for younger.
"Hi there,"
she said in her thick southern drawl.
"Are you Andrew Venice?"
she asked. She sauntered into the room, walked over to the chair before his desk and seated herself demurely without even being asked. The angle gave Andrew a better look at her cleavage. He was starting to feel warm.
"My name is Yvonne Perrin, and I'm a friend of Callie Archer,"
she said. Callie Archer?
Henry Archer's wife.
Andrew dropped into his chair and started pushing papers aside in search of the report of Callie Archer.
"Widow, actually."
Yvonne smiled, and Andrew knew then that she was too hot of a woman to be handling in the summer. Those green eyes were starting to mesmerize him. He cleared his throat roughly.
So what can I do for you?
Venice said, trying to keep his mind on his work.
"Well, you see, I heard on the TV that the police were asking that if anyone knew anything about the Archer case, to please come forward."
She pushed a hand through her thick red tresses, brushing them out of her green eyes.
"So I thought I should come forward and tell you what I know."
"And just what do you know?"
Andrew asked. For a moment, Yvonne glanced over her shoulder. Then she looked back at him and leaned so she was braced on the far side of his desk.
I'm not the sort of girl who rats on her friends, mind you.
I'm not that kind of girl.
Kelly and I go back a few years. She's always been like a big sister to me, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know, Archer said.
Henry! Oh my God!
And you'll probably think I'm terrible for telling you this.
She looked at her hands.
Dude, my hands are huge.
I make that decision after you tell me. Yvonne pursed her luscious lips.
Well, as I said, Callie and I go back a ways to when she was Callie Lucent, before she married Henry. She tells me everything. Well, almost everything. Anyway, I knew her older brother Bruce, too? He's over at the hospital now, recovering from an automobile accident. I thought I would drop in and visit him, just to make him feel better. Callie said he was sort of blue, but he was asleep when I got there, and I didn't want to wake him up, but I didn't know what to do. I was going to leave when I decided to use that little bathroom in his room, and while I was in there, I heard people coming into his room. I was going to call out and let them know I was in there, but I heard Callie, and I heard Dr. Nance.
Dr. Nance? Andrew asked.
Arthur Nance.
Yvonne waved her hand around in the air as though shooing flies.
You spotted imaginary elves.
He's some big-time doctor there. Anyway, I heard Callie say, "Is he still asleep?" And Dr. Nance said, "Oh yeah, he's going to be out for a while."
She paused. And Andrew insisted.
It got quiet, and I opened the door, and Callie was kissing Dr. Nance like he was an old flame.
Andrew frowned. So what did you do?
Well, I didn't want them to know I was in there, and that I heard them and saw them, so I sort of slipped out of the room and left.
She cocked her head like a little girl afraid of being scolded.
Was that wrong with me? I just didn't want to embarrass them.
Just like that? Andrew asked. They didn't see you leave. Yvonne shook her head so the cascades of red hair shimmered like flames in a fireplace. God, he wished it was winter.
I was real quiet,
she said.
Anyway, that's what I know. It's what I saw.
And just why are you telling me this now?
Because it was back before Henry died, and it made me wonder if he knew Callie might actually be having an affair with the doctor who was looking after her older brother.
Andrew sighed. Well, I want to thank you for coming in and telling me this, he said as he stood up. Yvonne pulled herself out of the chair and nodded.
Thank you for letting me tell you,
she said.
It's a load off my mind, and can sure tell you.
If you think of anything else, Andrew said, give me a call.
I will,
she said and smiled.
Bye now.
She sauntered back out of the office just as Sergeant was returning. Sergeant pulled off his hat again and nodded to her as she passed. Then he took his hat and started to fan himself while smiling at Andrew. Now that's what I call one hard little lady, the sergeant said. I wish I was a few years younger, I do. Are you going to ask her out? Don't be ridiculous! Andrew snarled and motioned the sergeant to leave. Still grinning like a hyena, the sergeant wandered away. Then Andrew sat down and started staring at his papers. So Arthur Nance and Callie Archer have a past, Andrew muttered. That was something to ponder.
Georgia on my mind.
thanks to all of my Patreon supporters, particularly Michael Maris and Break System BSE. As you can see, we are still in the process of figuring out what the new channel is going to look like, but nothing too important is going to change.